Meanwhile, Twilight watched on from the window, and when she saw the events transpire before her, she couldn't help but smile.
Good for them,
She said to herself before trotting off to find her friends. They have to know the truth. Rainbow Dash stayed with Pinkie Pie until another nurse pony came to inform her that visiting hours were over. Rainbow Dash didn't want to leave, but she knew the importance of good breakfast for an injured pony like Pinkie Pie, and so did what was best for her. With a long, embracing hug, the two parted ways, and Rainbow Dash finally headed home. She idly considered going to talk to the other fillies that were so upset with her earlier, but convinced herself that it was too soon for that. When she got to her cloud house, she stared at the bed with uncertainty. This was where the nightmares began, and she feared that they would happen against night. However, she was far too exhausted from her long ordeal to consider any alternative. Despite her physical pain, she had little trouble succumbing to the sweet respite of sleep. Her nightmares didn't haunt her that night. In the morning, Rainbow Dash felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Well rested. Although she was still in a bit of pain from her physical injuries, it was now at a tolerable level. It would take a few days more for her bruises to heal, and much longer still for the emotional. Still, she was happy for the first time in a long time, and she wasted no time getting out of bed to start the day. After a warm, relaxing bath to get the knots out of her joints and a thorough grooming session to fix her horribly mangled mane and tail, she decided to head off to see Pinkie Pie in the hospital. However, before she made it very far, a thought crossed her mind and a light went on in her head. With a smile, she switched directions and instead headed towards Pinkie Pie's bakery. When she arrived, the first thing she noticed was that the bakery was void of life. That was to be expected, however, since it was only recently the scene of a crime. Rainbow Dash swooped into the doorway and looked around. It was pretty much the way they left it. Only the bloodstains were cleared, and the weapon used in the assault was removed from the scene. Rainbow Dash was relieved, however, as she didn't want to be reminded of that horrific attack. Wasting no time, Dash collected one of the Pinkie Pie's cookbooks and proceeded to read through a certain cupcake recipe. After a bit of trial and error, Rainbow Dash finally managed to make some cupcakes that she thought were of acceptable quality. Therefore, she topped them off each with a different type of icing before she collected them into a basket and carried it out the door on her wings. She stopped in her tracks when she arrived outside. There waiting for her were all her former friends, along with Twilight. Rarity was the first to step forward, and when she was close enough, she raised her hoof. Rainbow Dash closed her eyes and turned her head, grimacing, as if prepared for another hard smack. But it never arrived. Instead, she felt a hoof rest on her shoulder. Rainbow Dash turned her head back towards Rarity and opened her eyes. To surprise, she noticed Rarity was smiling.
Twilight explained everything to us. To think you were suffering like that, it's absolutely dreadful. Therefore, I'm so sorry for hitting you. I should have given you a chance to explain yourself first. Can you forgive me?
Rainbow Dash retorted.
No, Rarity, you don't need to apologize for anything. I deserved it for what I've done. I should be ready for your forgiveness. Then, how about we both say we're sorry together? Sounds fair. On 3. 1, 2, 3. I'm sorry!
Rainbow Dash and Rarity said in unison. Then they smiled at each other and hugged. Next up was Fluttershy, who wrapped her hooves around Rainbow Dash and squeezed tight. Dash returned the embrace. No words were said, but she didn't need them, as the sudden wetness on her shoulder expressed Fluttershy's feelings perfectly. Last was Applejack. Her expression was that of anger still, or so it seems, as she had her eyes furrowed at Rainbow Dash as she walked up to her. Dash's smile faded as she watched Applejack with uncertainty while she closed the gap between them. There she sat on her haunches and stared sharply at her. There was a long, uncomfortable silence, but eventually Applejack broke the tension with a sigh, saying,
If everyone else can forgive you, then I suppose I can too. Friends again?
She held out a hoof. Dash's smile returned.
Friends again!
She replied as she pressed her free hoof against hers. Twilight stepped forward then and said,
We all want you to know that we love you and that we will always be there for you, no matter what. Thanks, you guys. I love you too.
Rainbow Dash replied as a tear rolled down her cheek.
Now let's go visit Pinkie Pie,
Twilight concluded. Yeah, they all said in unison. They arrived at the hospital a short time later, and it only took a short time for the nurse pony to escort them to Pinkie Pie's room. As usual, Pinkie Pie was delighted to see all her friends, most of all Rainbow Dash, and they all gave her a proper greeting with a hug and a get well soon.
Pinkie Pie, I have something for you,
Rainbow Dash told her as they greeted each other properly.
What can it be?
She inquired with enthusiasm. Rainbow Dash smiled, placed a basket on blankets covering her stomach, and removed a sheet.
Cupcakes.
Pinkie Pie's eyes lit up.
Cupcakes? For me?
Dash nodded cheerfully.
Yep.
She grabbed one with one hoof and immediately began to nibble on it.
They're so good,
She said with her mouth full.
What a thoughtful gift.
Twilight commented her.
Well, that's just how I roll.
She responded. She was finally sounding like her old self again. Pinkie Pie reached for another one, brought it to her mouth, and then stopped as she stared at the other feelings gathering around her.
Is something wrong, dear?
Rarity inquired. The other stared at Pinkie Pie with concern.
There's something wrong,
Pinkie Pie said glumly as she returned the cupcake to the basket. The other's expressions turned to that of dread. Then Pinkie's expression changed to happiness again.
You guys haven't had a taste yet.
She then handed the basket to all of her friends. The others smiled and took a cupcake for themselves and gorged on.
Wow, y'all made these, Rainbow Dash? They're delicious.
Applejack praised.
Very much so,
Fluttershy added cheerfully. Dash rubbed the back of her head, blushing at all the praise.
Ah, shucks, you guys.
She glanced over each of her friends as they ate and smiled to herself. They weren't just her friends. They were her comrades, ponies who would always be there for her even through her worst of times, now and forever. She was truly blessed. The six talked on as they ate, breaking only to take another bite of delicious cupcakes. They joked, they laughed, but most importantly, they hung out like best friends should. As visiting hours ended, the ponies said their goodbyes and headed off towards their respective homes, all except for Rainbow Dash. She had been behind on her work, after all, and has a lot of catching up to do. She worked busily for the rest of the day, clearing the clouds and making sure it rained where it needed to. For the first time in a long time, Rainbow Dash had her spunk back, and she wasn't about to let it go to waste. Her nightmares returned that night, but they weren't the same as before. This time she saw herself standing over Pinkie Pie, ready to dig the scalpel into her chest, and the moment she did, she woke up screaming. Moments later, there was a hoof on her shoulder. She gasped out of fright. She swerved her head only to see Fluttershy hovering above her.
Fluttershy? When I snuck in after you went to sleep, I was worried you'd have those awful nightmares, and I don't want you to be alone. Please don't get angry.
But she wasn't angry. On the contrary, she was grateful she was there, and confided in the details of the nightmare.
Oh, how terrible! I can't have you dreaming about such horrid things. I'll stay with you and make sure those nightmares don't bother you again.
Dash smiled at her.
Thanks, Fluttershy.
They curled up in bed together, and when Dash finally managed to fall back to sleep, she slept soundly for the rest of the night. The next day, Fluttershy encouraged Rainbow Dash to tell her friends about her nightmares, and she followed her advice. When they heard about it, they all agreed to help out by letting Dash stay at their homes until her nightmares stopped. She was happy to oblige. Over the next few days, she repeated the process of making cupcakes for Pinkie Pie, and shared them with her and all her friends. When visiting hours ended, she returned to her chores, and by the time night came, she headed not to her own home, but to the home of one of her friends. They were always willing to accommodate her with whatever she needed. They were always by her side to comfort her whenever her nightmares returned. Every night her nightmares came few and farther between. 2 weeks later, Pinkie Pie was released from the hospital. Though she had a clean bill of health, she was still encouraged to take it easy for the next few weeks. She wore no more bandages, but the scar from Rainbow Dash's assault remained, a grim reminder to all of her friends of what Rainbow Dash did to her. However, Rainbow Dash treated it as a sign to never forget the friendship that they had for each other. As for her nightmares, thanks to the constant help and support of her friends, never bothered her again.